Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our The Basics of Vendor Business Continuity, Disaster Recovery, and Pandemic Plans webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hershey Long, VendMinder's Senior Information Security Analyst. He will discuss what your vendor needs to provide to demonstrate they are prepared for business interruptions and recovery to normal operations, as well as how to ensure that your vendors have taken the appropriate precautions and have thoroughly tested their business continuity management and disaster recovery plans. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our Do Your Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Plans Consider Your Critical Vendors infographic, who is responsible for third-party risk management toolkit, and our vendor business continuity and disaster recovery checklist, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hershey. Hershey, the floor is now yours.
Hey, thanks, Jesse. So in this session, we're going to discuss why vendor business continuity management is important. We'll discuss the differences between business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans. We'll go over what a business impact analysis or a BIA is. We'll talk about how the supply chain has affected business continuity planning, and then we'll have some key takeaways at the end. All right, so let's start with business continuity management, or BCM for short. Now, BCM is a comprehensive program designed to support and protect an organization's overall operations. It's basically an umbrella term that encompasses 3 major areas of focus, with those being business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic planning. So let's go over these 3. So business continuity planning helps ensure that the organization and their vendors' key operations, products, and services continue to be delivered either in full or at a predetermined and accepted level of availability. Next, we have disaster recovery planning. And this includes a set of processes and procedures to follow at the immediate onset of an incident, typically a catastrophic natural occurrence such as a storm or a hurricane or a tornado or a fire, or even something man-made such as large-scale accidents, gas leaks, or even chemical explosions. Disaster recovery planning guides protocols up to the resumption of normal operations. Now we have pandemic planning. Pandemic planning includes an active document listing the strategies, procedures, and preventive measures, as well as any corresponding implementation guidelines an organization will take should a global health crisis occur. And each one of your vendors should have an adequate and up-to-date pandemic plan. The past several years has taught us the importance of maintaining a pandemic plan. A vendor's BCM program should align with its strategic goals and objectives. Management should consider a vendor's role within and impact on the overall industry when it develops a BCM program. BCM should require management to have processes in place to oversee and implement resiliency, continuity and response capabilities to safeguard employees, customers, products, and services. The most important being the safeguard of people. Resiliency incorporates proactive measures to mitigate disruptive events, and evaluating an organization's recovery capabilities should also be included in a BCM. So why is a BCM so important? Well, there's a couple of things we point out here. So first, it considers the direct impact on availability. A BCM allows for you and your vendors to proactively plan for disasters and business interruptions. It also allows you to provide assurance to your customers that your product or service will always be available. And also it protects you from data loss and also financial loss. Now, before we dive in, let's make sure that we're all on the same page. What is business continuity and disaster recovery? Many people confuse these two concepts, so let's break these down. Now, business continuity is what an organization does to ensure that key operations, products, and services continue to be delivered either in full or at a predetermined and accepted level of availability after a business impacting event. Now, disaster recovery, on the other hand, is more of a subset of business continuity. Disaster recovery outlines the process and procedures that the organization will follow at the immediate onset of an incident up to and including the organization getting back to normal operations. Disaster recovery is typically IT-centric, and this involves the recovery of the information technology environment, so the data centers, the server rooms, recovering data would mostly be dealing with disaster recovery. And on the other hand, you have business continuity, which handles resumption of operations in the organization as a whole and dealing with how people are going to provide business continuity. Now, how does this relate to vendor management, though? Both business continuity and disaster recovery are outlined in a service level agreement, otherwise known as an SLA, inside the contracts your organization has with your vendors. So when you think of business continuity and your vendor, it covers things, what they should do in the event of like loss of personnel, loss of their facilities or even the vendor's facilities, or in general that services have gone down. You need to know what your vendor is planning with public entities such as emergency services and communications with their own key vendors, their clients like you, their employees, and media. The business continuity process starts with a business impact analysis or a BIA. Now, the BIA will define recovery time objectives or RTO, recovery point objectives or RPO, and maximum tolerable downtime or NTD. That's quite a few acronyms, and we'll cover those terms shortly. It's important to note your organization and your vendors, especially those critical to your operations, should have a business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan. You'll want to verify that your vendor's timelines, the RTO, and RPO especially, fall within your organization's timelines. All right, so let's talk about some of those acronyms. So the BIA, or Business Impact Analysis, is the process which forecasts what might happen if your organization experiences a business impacting event and gathers information needed to determine how you recover from those events. Relating to vendor management, your operations may be impacted by one of your vendors if they are experiencing a business impacting event, which, depending on their criticality to you, may immediately impact your operations or may have a delayed impact to your operations if the vendor doesn't resume normal operations quickly. Now, the recovery time objective, or the RTO, is the amount of time it's expected to take to recover back to those normal operations or at a predefined acceptable state. Determining the RTO is important for selecting appropriate technologies and strategies. When it's not feasible to meet an RTO, management should verify whether the RTO is even realistic, and they need to initiate an action plan and milestones to document the situation and, when appropriate, plan for its mitigation. Management should consider interconnected RTOs for each business function to determine the total downtime caused by a disruption. Establishing realistic RTOs assist management in determining a critical path and hierarchy for recovery. For example, a process with a shorter RTO that is dependent upon a process with a longer RTO may indicate a gap that should be analyzed further. Whether driven by customer expectations or technological advancement, previously established RTOs that were a few hours in duration may now require near real-time recovery. Therefore, it might be appropriate for management to reevaluate currently acceptable RTOs. All right, now there's recovery point objective, or the RPO. Now, the RPO represents the point in time before disruption to which data can be recovered
given the most recent backup copy of the data after an outage. So, for example, if you only do a backup once a day at 1 a.m., if a business impacting event occurs at midnight, you're going to lose all of the data from the prior 23 hours. So the lowest RPO an organization that only backs up once per day could have is 24 hours. Now, the maximal tolerable downtime, or the MTD, represents the total amount of time the system owner or authorizing official is willing to accept for a business process disruption and includes all impact considerations. The MTD is important for contingency planners when selecting an appropriate recovery method and developing the scope and depth of recovery procedures. Examiners may encounter other terminology to describe MTD, such as the maximal allowable downtime. Exceeding the maximal tolerable downtime means that the business may not recover from this event. Failure to meet established metrics such as an RPO, an RTO, or even the MTD may have operational impacts, including discontinued or reduced service levels, inability to meet security requirements, workflow disruptions, supply chain disruptions, we'll talk about that later, and delays of business initiatives. The financial impact could include the loss of revenue, increased costs, or fines and penalties. All right, so let's talk about pandemic planning. Pandemic planning is preparing for a pandemic event by planning, exercising, and translating plans into actions as part of a response. An example of a pandemic event is a major health crisis. When it comes to your vendors, this serves as a roadmap which communicates how they plan to continue business services while facing a pandemic. The absence of a necessary infrastructure and planning for critical situations such as an influenza outbreak or even COVID-19 can lead to a cascade of failures, resulting in a breakdown of processes and an interruption of supplies and services. Knowing your vendors, especially your high-risk and critical vendors, have a pandemic plan is an important puzzle piece within your own pandemic planning and is critical for protecting your employees, your customers, and overall business operations. Now, there is a misconception that having a business continuity plan means that an organization is prepared for a pandemic. However, business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic planning are similar and fall into the same family, but they're not the same. Pandemic planning is part of your overall business continuity plan, and it's one element within BCM, as it was noted earlier. Now, here are some common features of a pandemic plan. Those include recommendations from local, state, or federal agencies, such as the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the World Health Organization, and state and federal health departments. It also could include mass absenteeism. This is when most or even all employees avoid the office facility for a good reason, such as a pandemic. Work from home strategy. This includes employees can resume business from their home office. And in addition to that, remote work capability. Employees can resume business from anywhere with an internet connection and employees' VPN. It could include travel restrictions on travel due to health risk, a quarantine, requiring employees that are showing any symptoms of illness to avoid the office and remain isolated at home, regular deep cleaning of office facilities, and even having hand sanitation stations available. Please remember that real-life scenarios will happen. It's just a matter of time. We talk about what could happen, and we can talk about all kinds of natural disasters or man-made disasters, and they're all going to be different. You want to know what plans your vendor has in place for these items. So here are some example situations. Your online baking provider is a victim of a cyber attack leading to the exposure of 1 million customer records. Is your vendor ready to respond with a communications plan and a designated public speaker? Do they have a plan in place to sustain the reputational impact? If a hazardous material has spilled at the facility and is preventing your vendor's employees from accessing the main office facility, does your vendor have plans for how to mitigate needing to be in the office? Or how about this? an electrical fire destroys your vendor's server room, will they be able to get it back up and running within the standard RTO and RPO? A major power outage occurs at the vendor's facility. Do they have an alternate facility to continue operations or work from home capability? This actually happened at a facility I was working at once. Or how about this, just to piggyback off of pandemic planning, another global pandemic hits and it's affecting millions of people. What precautions is your vendor taking regarding its employees? Will there be mass absenteeism, which may impact the delivery of products and services? So those are some things just to think about.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your organization ensure that your vendors' business continuity and disaster recovery plans include board or executive leadership oversight? Yes, somewhat, no, or not sure. Hershey, we have some time now to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience. And that question is, what is the best way to obtain RTO and RPO times and test results?
All right, thank you for the question. So in most cases, defined RTO and RPO times are included in your vendor's business impact analysis and in their business continuity and disaster recovery testing results. If it's not included, you may need to explicitly ask them for this information as it pertains to whatever product or service your organization is using of the vendor.
Thanks, Hershey. We have about 40 seconds left on this open poll question, so please get those results in as quickly as possible. If you have any issues completing the poll question, please send us a message in the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist. If you have any other questions throughout the session, you can also ask those in the Ask Question widget, and we will try to get to your question live. We will be closing this poll in just about 15 seconds. Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the Related Content widget, you'll find informative resources such as our Do Your Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Plans Consider Your Critical Vendors infographic. We encourage you to check out this helpful resource if you're looking for even more information. Okay, Hershey, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, so now let's discuss board and senior management oversight in business continuity management. Your vendor's board and senior management team should govern the entire business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic planning process by defining responsibilities and accountability and allocating adequate resources to business continuity. Therefore, ensure your vendor's plans include board oversight. The board should be aligning business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic planning with organizations' business strategy and risk appetite. The board should fully understand the risk and adopt policies and plans to manage events. And the board should be reviewing operating results and performance. Board oversight is mission critical. They want to see from an exam and audit perspective that the board is doing more than just listening to some random report, that the board is engaging and asking questions. Like, how do you prove that? The activity must be captured in a set of minutes. Otherwise, the examiners or auditors are going to do a doc request and get all the minutes and mention that not one time did you mention the business continuity, disaster recovery, or pandemic plan. And the same goes for senior management. They too should be actively involved and engaged in business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic planning. And your vendors should be doing the same. They should have their board and senior management involved. So you should be asking your vendors, hey, can you show me where your board is engaged? Can you show me something that says your board is engaged with what you're doing? Especially for those critical and high-risk vendors, those are the ones that have access to your data and or your customers' data. Those vendors should be willing to share more detailed information with you than vendors who typically would not be considered high or critical risk. We're going to have to demonstrate from a vendor perspective that we can provide those agreed services. We're going to have to demonstrate to auditors, examiners, and regulators that we've done our homework. Some of senior management's major responsibilities include creating and implementing a business continuity exercise strategy, establishing measurable goals, validating that employees understand their business continuity roles and responsibilities, verifying testing and updating strategies and plans to reflect current business conditions and the operating environment. The testing, of course, needs to include pandemic planning, but to show pandemic plans have been tested should be really easy now. And again, the same examiners and auditors want to see that senior management is engaged. You need to show that the senior management is engaged. Now, these examiners and auditors are going to want an analysis and review of your third party's business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans. They're going to want to see documentation of this. Examiners and auditors will look to see that your vendor's strategic goals and objectives align with your business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans, or that you've taken mitigating steps where necessary. They'll look to ensure that the board and senior management are engaged and proof that it's happening. Proof would be that everything is captured in minutes. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. Auditors and examiners are going to be more on top of this considering our world has so fundamentally changed over the last few years. They want to know that you have a risk-based approach and that you talk about it and test it on a regular, recurring basis.
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization currently utilize a business impact analysis as part of your third-party risk management? Yes, no, or not sure? First, we have another question here that we can go ahead and answer. And that question is, how often should our BIA be updated?
So the industry standard is at least annually, or when there are significant organizational changes, such as changes to business processes, technology, or even changes to key personnel at the executive level.
Great, thanks so much, Hershey. We have a little over a minute left on our open poll question here, so please take your time and get those answers in. Just a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all of the poll questions that appear on your screen during the presentation, and you also must be in attendance for the entire live session. If you all have any questions that you would like to add to the Ask Question widget, please feel free to do that as well, and we will try to get those answered during our live session. We'll be closing this poll in just about 15 seconds, so please go ahead and get those answers in. Thank you. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before we move on, I'd like to point out that in the related content widget, you can find our Who is Responsible for Third-Party Risk Management Toolkit. As we just discussed the board, executive management, and leadership oversight, you might find this resource helpful. I'll hand it back over to you, Hershey.
So business continuity management is a risk-based enterprise-wide activity. It requires a BIA, business impact analysis, and focuses on your risk factors. You cannot do it without involving and managing every aspect of that process, including defining the touch points between your lines of business. When we say BCM involves managing the possibility of an event that jeopardizes critical systems, while true, it extends to your entire operation. You want to ask yourself and vendors, what are you doing? How are you doing that? Why are you doing what you're doing? Does that make sense for your use of that vendor? So here's an ideal scenario. There's a company called NESPA, and it's utilizing Fidelity Investment Services, which is a third-party vendor. So what is Fidelity doing? Fidelity is a brokerage firm that provides retirement services, fund distribution, investment advice, checking accounts, and credit cards. NESPA utilizes Fidelity's retirement services, their 401k and Roth IRA for their employees. How are they doing that? Fidelity allows investors to buy stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, ETFs, options, Forex, and even Bitcoin all online. Each employee can create their own retirement portfolio or use a default portfolio or determine which assets that their money will go to. Fidelity allows traders to purchase fractional shares, which gives investors an option to diversify into higher cost stocks by purchasing a slice or a share rather than the full amount. So why are you doing what you're doing? Well, NESPA wants to help employees reach their financial goals, wants to help its employees grow their wealth, and it wants to help its employees retire comfortably. So does this make sense for the use of that vendor? Yeah, Fidelity is one of the most trusted wealth management companies, and their cybersecurity practices align with NESPA's. So let's expand a little on what a business impact analysis, BIA, is and means from a third-party risk management perspective. It's where we go through and try to figure out what the impact is on your business and whether there will be any significant loss. From a vendor perspective, you're going to look at that vendor and ask a few questions. So ask, would a sudden loss of this vendor cause a material disruption to my organization? Would that sudden loss of this vendor impact our customers? Would the time to recover be greater than one business day? Overall, the BIA is an analysis to determine whether your organization can operate effectively while the vendor is unavailable. Your management team should develop a BIA for your organization to follow. Now, traditionally, your BIA should be reviewed at least annually. It should be reviewed when there is updated regulatory guidance or when significant changes occur within your organization or the vendors, or if you begin using that vendor differently, such as expanding the services or products they provide to you. It all comes back to risk. So think about the example I used with Fidelity. What if Fidelity was hit with a business disruption? How would that disruption impact NESPA's everyday business operations? Well, considering that Fidelity provides services mainly to NESPA's employees and not necessarily NESPA's customers, regular operations most likely won't be impacted. However, it may create concern amongst employees regarding their investment accounts, and they may want to know when Fidelity intends to be back up and running.
All right. Just like that old saying that the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, that's particularly true of the world of third-party risk management. Industry best practice and regulatory guidance wants you to consider all of the potential ramifications posed by a third party, whether in the form of a data breach or a business disruption. That's why, from a planning standpoint, you need to consider all of the possible problems that could occur, what steps you need to be prepared to take, and how long until normal operations can resume in order to minimize the impact to your organization and to your customers. And remember, the work that you do should be well documented. Documentation is important. If it isn't documented, then it didn't really happen. That's the idea that's going to come to effect anyway, especially for examiners and auditors. Also, you need to make sure it's evidenced in work products, including meeting minutes showing that you've kept your senior management team and board regularly involved and updated. So why and when is a business continuity review of your vendor important? Well, how confident are you in that your third party would survive in the face of a disruption? If your BIA shows that your organization cannot operate effectively while your vendor is unavailable, you should be thoroughly evaluating those vendors' business continuity and disaster recovery plans to ensure they are adequate, and you should understand the procedures they have in place to handle a business impacting event so you too can be prepared. And why should you care about your vendor's business continuity and disaster recovery preparedness? Well, that's actually a good question, and here's a couple of reasons. If a part of your services were unavailable for an undetermined amount of time because of your vendor, that could significantly affect your operations and reputation. A commonly overlooked aspect of risk is the reputational impact that can occur to a business from failure to respond to the situation or failure to continue operations. Reputation is difficult to cultivate, easy to lose, and very hard, if not impossible, to regain once lost. You also benefit from knowing how quickly your vendors plan to recover and if they will be able to quickly and effectively respond to the business impacting event so that you can plan accordingly within your own business continuity and disaster recovery plans. All right, so I've mentioned BIA a lot so far, so let's discuss what's involved in the BIA process. Management should evaluate the potential impact of disruptive events, including operational, financial, and reputational impacts, as well as all other types of risk. Management should establish recovery objectives after determining the impact of a disruption. Common measurements include recovery point objective, or the RPO, recovery time objective, or RTO, and maximal tolerable downtime, MTD, as we discussed. Where applicable, these measurements should be evaluated for alignment with third-party service providers' contracted recovery expectations. Your recovery strategies and the technologies used will heavily influence these measurements. Now, the BIA should include assessing critical business functions and their supporting functions and any vendors involved in supporting those functions, even sometimes evaluating fourth parties. Those are your vendors' third parties. You'll find these things out through reviewing workflows, organizational charts, network topology diagrams, data flow diagrams, and performing interviews with key personnel. You'll also want to consider whether your backup or replacement vendors for your critical vendors use the same infrastructure or are located in the same general region, as they could potentially be impacted by the same event your primary vendor is experiencing. Now, we really haven't defined resiliency yet and how it plays into business continuity management, so let's go over that. There's a lot to consider about an organization being resilient. Think about offices, data centers, the equipment within each, the vendors those buildings rely on to operate, such as power and telecommunications, the data that lives on the equipment within each, and the people performing processes. You then have more layers. Such maintenance of the equipment those buildings and data rely on, as well as the architecture and the implementation of the supporting systems, such as implementing equipment in an N+1 or 2N configuration. Now let me explain these. N+1 being that you have the necessary number of components of a system needed for it to operate at the desired thresholds, which is N, and the +1 means that you have at least one extra. This is useful for performing maintenance so that when you have to perform maintenance, you need to take a component down. The system is going to operate effectively still, or you can risk having a component fail. Now, 2N, on the other hand, means that you have twice the capacity that is required and is often configured as an isolated system from the primary system. Then there is, of course, the concept of primary and secondary data centers, where in a hot or active-active scenario, an entire system is replicated to another data center, hopefully geographically distanced as to not be affected by the same business impacting event. So not only may systems within a single data center be resilient or redundant, the entire data center may be redundant. And just as a side note here, we consider geographically distant data centers to be 100 miles or more apart. The more resilient your organization is, the more mitigating factors are in place before you would have to enact your business continuity, disaster recovery, or pandemic plans. Management should evaluate whether there are appropriate resources to ensure resiliency. You can determine your vendor's resiliency by asking them for the following items: evidence of physical resiliency, such as multiple internet circuits coming from diverse carriers and paths, multiple power feeds, data center scale uninterruptible power systems or UPS and generators, maintenance and testing of supporting systems, as well as many other infrastructure resiliency items we haven't mentioned, like smoke and fire detection and suppression, as well as detection of anomalous events over which could predict or provide early warning for a system failure, such as precise and abundant temperature and humidity or dew point monitoring. You also could ask them about their data center recovery alternatives. What backup data and replication strategies are being used? Is the pandemic plan covering the loss of personnel in place? Or even, are there SOC reports, independent audits to verify the systems and processes are in place?
Our next poll question is, do you consider supply chain management as part of your third-party risk program today? Yes, no, or not sure? Hershey, let's go ahead and answer one more question from the audience. And that question is, what is the difference between supply chain management and regular business continuity management?
Yeah, so supply chain management, or SCM, is more specific, and it's really about the management of the flow of the data, the goods, and the finances associated with a product or service from the procurement stage to the final destination. Now, on the other hand, business continuity management is more about the support and protection of an organization's overall operations in the areas of business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic planning.
Thanks, Hershey. Just a reminder, if you are having any issues submitting your poll answer, please feel free to send us a message via the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist. If you have any other questions to ask, you can also place those in the Ask Question widget, and we will either answer live or send a follow-up via email to you. We've got about 30 seconds left on this poll question. And we'll be closing this poll out in just about 10 seconds, so please get those answers in. Thank you. And here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question, as it's always interesting to see what everyone says. Before we move on, I'd like to mention that we have our Vendor Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Checklist available for download in the Related Content widget. This checklist provides a list of what to look for in your vendor's plans to ensure they are adequate. Let's continue with the presentation. Hershey, back to you.
All right, thank you, Jesse. So let's go over the role of supply chain management plays within your third-party risk management. So over the last few years, we've all felt the strain of supply chain disruption, whether it be from like high gas prices, increased grocery costs, long production times, or even like major storms such as like hurricane or tornadoes, even floods. There have been countless examples to learn from. Understanding what your vendors' plans are to respond to business disrupting events and how they monitor their vendors is very critical. When assessing your third-party vendors, ensure they disclose any fourth or nth parties. These are the vendors' third parties that are considered critical in providing products and services to you, or that pose risks that could threaten your organization's operations, regulatory compliance, or reputation. And interesting enough, according to our annual State of the Third Party Risk Management 2023 white paper, 39% of survey respondents, organizations, and/or vendors experienced incidents with a limited impact due to supply chain disruption in 2022. All right, now it may be difficult to foresee the ripple effect that supply chain disruptions may have. Just a few years ago, and even currently, we're witnessing the impact of these disruptions. So here are some examples of industries that have been heavily impacted by these supply chain disruptions. We've got manufacturing, there's retail, and then there's restaurants and food. With manufacturing, there's a large number of third parties, or just having a large number of third parties, that comes with a large amount of risk. So inherently, you have more third parties, you have more risk. Manufacturers are directly affected by supply chain disruptions, poor quality service, and data breaches. So they need to have recovery plans and a robust due diligence process and manage their third-party relationships on an ongoing basis. So with retail, the key issues remain in transportation of goods and labor. All U.S. importers and manufacturers must comply with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or the UFLPA. The organization will need to focus some additional effort on supply chain transparency to determine exactly who your suppliers are, what they're providing, and how they plan on providing those services in the case of supply chain disruption. They'll also need to know who their suppliers are and how their goods are actually being manufactured. With restaurants and food, I mentioned on the previous slide that one of the effects of these supply chain disruptions was an increase in groceries. Well, these are all one and the same. So with this, you have rising ingredients, you have rising labor costs, and rising utility costs. And this is because supply chain disruptions have been pressuring companies in the restaurant industry. And we actually still see this trend to this day. So from the past few slides, you can kind of get an idea of what a supply chain disruption is and the effect of it. And here's a more formal definition of it. A supply chain disruption can really be anything that negatively impacts the flow, creation, sale, or distribution of a product. And there's several categories for this, so we'll go over them. So first, there's disasters, obviously. And disaster could be an example that we saw with the Japan earthquake and tsunami. Japan's devastating earthquake and tsunami put a significant proportion of the world's automotive supply chains out of action. They were unable to ship or receive needed parts, and Toyota, GM, and even Nissan all temporarily shut down facilities in Japan and also in the United States. So that's just an example of, like, even though an event happened, halfway around the world, it definitely had an impact in other parts of the world. Another disaster is like hurricanes, like such as with Florence, Sandy, and Maria. The Hurricane Maria that hit Puerto Rico really ravaged the pharmaceutical and medical devices, which is like the island's biggest industry. With Hurricane Florence, supply chain struggled to even catch up with the backlog of deliveries. Roads and rail connections were flooded, and this prevented travel, and many warehouses and buildings were downed. As we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, this really hit the restaurant and food industry hard. Many restaurants had to temporarily close or even went out of business completely because of the public health concerns. Recently, we saw a financial fluctuation when we saw the SVB bank failure. Interesting enough, Roku, which is a huge company, had $487 million in cash at that failed financial institution. All right, and here are a few more examples of supply chain disruptions. You have cybersecurity incidents or breaches, grand-scale recalls, or even component shortages. There's cybersecurity incidents such as with the Okta hack. As I mentioned previously, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and this event was a perfect example of this, because what cyber criminals were doing were targeting low-paid tech support workers who had access to the keys to the kingdom, which is basically how the Okta happened. And there's other examples such as the GitHub attack, the Access Press, and others. Grand scale recalls are also an example of supply chain disruption. Back in 1982, there was the major Tylenol recall. More recently, Samsung, which is one of the largest smartphone makers in the world, had to recall really, I think it was their Galaxy Note 7 because it started bursting into flames because the battery was overheating. And also you have component shortages, such as in the case of the automobile microchips. Now, let's wrap up with a few best practices for reviewing business continuity and disaster recovery plans. You'll want to assess risk early and be thorough as possible. Have clear guidelines on what must be done at each stage of the relationship, pre- and post-contract signature. Contractually commit the vendor to test their plans. Record anticipated results, assess any vulnerabilities, and thoroughly document those. And I recommend that the vendors test their plans at least annually. Remember that real-life problems do happen and will happen. It's just a matter of time. And clear expectations and notification requirements are critical, especially for those critical and high-risk vendors. And I think that last bullet point, clear expectations and notification requirements, are key to your success. Now, here are some additional best practices and takeaways. Request your high and critical risk third parties plans. Chances are you've already requested this information from them, but if you haven't, you should. Sift through their plans and ensure it meets your needs and expectations, and if not, you need to enact mitigated controls of your own. Communicate with your vendors. Make sure that you have a really good rapport with your vendors. Simply reach out and ask them how they're doing. Make sure to share your expectations with them during this challenging time or any challenging time, as well as ask about their expectations of you. Remember, especially during challenging times such as a pandemic, you're in it together. Watch for signs of a stressed vendor. Indicators of a stressed vendor include limited capacity, lack of staff, or weak execution of a plan. Address any concerns with your vendors immediately. Refer to recent regulatory guidance. Review the Interagency Statement on Pandemic Planning issued FFIEC agencies. There are several callouts regarding critical third parties, as right now your regulatory risk is heightened. Even if you're not regulated by the FFIEC, sound advice is to refer to the guidance. If you're not facing regulatory risk, you're undoubtedly facing reputational risk. Be aware of your vendor's cybersecurity plans. Now more than ever, especially since I mentioned the breach involving Okta, you should understand the cybersecurity measures your vendors have in place. Their employees are likely working from home, and bad actors will continue to prey upon any system vulnerability. Remember, the weakest link in the chain. Prioritize reviewing your business impact analysis. The BIA assists with determining whether your organization can sustain operations should your vendor become unavailable. Circling back to your BIA will help you identify and highlight the critical parts of your organization as well as your critical vendors. Review your critical vendors' remote operations. Have any vendors who generally don't have employees working from home now have them? As vendors scramble to make remote work possible, security measures are often bypassed. So it's important to pay attention to these vendors in particular. Analyze your critical vendors' financial security. An organization's financial posture is very fluid right now. It's changing by the day. They may have been fine last month, but that may not be the case today. So if your vendor is working with someone like Roku, they might have to reevaluate that relationship. Confirm that you have a redundancy plan. Verify there is a redundancy plan, which is essentially a backup vendor for every critical vendor. And finally, for new vendors you partner with now going forward, ensure you utilize SLAs for protection.
Great, thanks so much, Hershey. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I'd also like to thank Hershey for his time in sharing some very important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars, our How to Review Your Vendor's Business Continuity, Disaster Recovery, and Pandemic Plans webinar on June 15th, and our Creating an Effective Vendor Document Collection Process webinar on June 27th. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hershey, our next question is, how would you describe the difference between RTO and MTD to a business owner? Hershey, I believe you may be muted. I'm not hearing you come through the speaker.
Oh, I apologize for that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yep, you're there. Thank you.
Okay, gotcha. Sorry. So yeah, the MTD, that's important from the perspective of wanting to know at what point the vendor may decide that it may not be feasible financially to recover from a business impacting event. This would be something to know for your critical or high-risk vendors. The RTO is useful, as noted, is how much time the vendor expects or hopefully has tested that it will take to recover from any business impacting event.
Great. Our next question. What if my vendor won't give me documentation on their most recent disaster recovery test?
Oh yeah, this happens quite a bit. Well, there should be documented evidence that it was performed. Ideally, you want to see testing performed annually, and they should provide a summary of the test and results. Many organizations won't share the details of the test, and that's okay. Sometimes they consider this information proprietary, and sometimes it's for security reasons. But they should be able to provide documented evidence that it was performed and that issues were resolved or mitigated. And they should provide the date of when the DR test was conducted.
Perfect. Our next question. Should vendors test both their BC and DR plans annually? And can BC and DR testing be combined into a single activity?
Oh, yeah. So we do recommend both being tested at least annually, and they can be done together, but should reflect separate activities tested to demonstrate that the individual facets of a BC plan versus a DR plan are tested. So when we're talking about BC, we're thinking of more of a personnel, we're thinking more of a buildings and processes, and with the DR, we're thinking more of like technology, like applications and data centers.
Perfect. Next question. How likely will the larger vendors, such as AWS, GCP, and ServiceNow, provide these details on their internal operations?
Oh, yeah. So a lot of times these larger corporations that were just mentioned are more prepared to provide their materials or at least adequate summaries. They tend to be more accustomed to the request and have a standard package. With that being said, sometimes that package is very, I would say very generic, so you have to dig deeper and work with your representative to get what you need. This is where being prepared with exactly what you want can come in a really handy way, and also that you have built a good rapport with that vendor.
Great. Our next question here. Who should be reviewing the BC and DR plans within the organization? What is or should be the business's role? Yeah,
so on the BCDR side of due diligence, you'll want someone with really good demonstrable knowledge across information security and BCDR to perform these reviews. You'll want someone with experience that has experience with these reviews and isn't going to just do a mindless checklist with these reviews. That person likely won't be your third-party risk manager directly, but rather a supporting resource from your internal information security team. If these resources aren't available within your organization, you'll need to look to a third-party risk management service provider for assistance.
Great. And next question here. Some vendors point us to SOC reports for BCP and DRP info. Is this adequate, or what is your recommendation?
Oh, sorry, you cut out there. Can you repeat that question?
Of course. Some vendors point us to SOC reports for BCP and DRP info. Is this adequate, or what is your recommendation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my recommendation, usually in SOC reports, in most SOC reports, at least I've seen, there isn't a whole lot of information regarding business continuity and disaster recovery. My recommendation is to request the business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans directly from the vendor itself. They should have some type of documentation available, and there should be evidence that has been reviewed at least annually or when there's been significant organizational changes.
Great. One more question here. How do you engage the vendor in testing?
Yeah, so that goes back to one of the previous questions. So with testing, we want to know, how often they test, the type of testing that they conducted, and when testing was conducted. Now, some vendors aren't going to provide that information, and like I said, it's okay. However, they can, or they should, at least provide some type of information about their testing. So if you can't get any information from them, maybe have them fill out a questionnaire, such as a SIG, or even one of Vinbinder's questionnaires as well, that just asks some yes or no questions, or some simple questions about when the last test was conducted.
Great, and we have one more question. What does the tabletop exercise mean?
Oh yeah, so yeah, tabletop exercise. I've actually been involved in this. So basically, a tabletop exercise is just people from different departments. Usually, it could be from your human resources, from IT, even executive leadership, and you all just get into a classroom setting and you just talk and discuss certain scenarios. So, for example, you can discuss hey, what would happen if there was a fire at our facility? What would be the responsibilities of each team or each department? Or you can discuss, what would happen if a storm destroy the office facility and stuff like that, what actions you would take. So basically, it's just a big discussion about what would happen in certain scenarios. No technical testing is actually done in this case, and actually can be quite a bit of fun as well.
Great. Thanks, Hershey. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hershey, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We'd like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hershey as well for his time and content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank and online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, including business continuity and disaster recovery planning. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.